From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
2 months to Election Day, and just days before the first absentee ballots are mailed to voters. We've got new polling on the race as the Harris team launches a new campaign highlighting the fight over abortion rights.
We're joined this hour by Democratic Congresswoman Lori Trahan. The Army veteran weighs in on the race and the latest in the Middle East as thousands of protesters demand a ceasefire in Israel.
And as Benjamin Netanyahu responds to the weekend killing of 6 hostages, including 1 American, we'll talk U.S. strategy in the region with Michael Allen from Beacon Global Strategies. Well, Joe, welcome back to Washington. We missed you during your week off. And, of course, you come back just in time for the single-digit week countdown to the election to begin. We are 9 weeks out today.
Yeah, how about that? 2 months to go, 63 days, however you want to slice it. Maybe more importantly for us right now, 1 week until the big debate. That's going to be 1 week from tonight when we're back here with special coverage. But tomorrow we're going to start rounding out policy a little bit more, Kaylee, with breaking news right now on what Kamala Harris has to say about the economy.
Yeah, she'll, of course, be in New Hampshire, and ahead of that visit tomorrow, she's looking to cut red tape for small businesses. At least so says her campaign. She's aiming to expand the small business tax relief to boost startups, the campaign says, aiming to hike startup deductions to $50,000. That's up from $5,000. So pretty significant increase there, Joe.
That's for sure. It's interesting that she's still filling in the blanks, having already delivered an economic policy address, but she remains underwater with a lot of polling that we've seen in her favor on the top line, underwater when it comes to who you trust to handle the economy and inflation.
And, of course, she's still trying to court union labor with much of this economic policy. She marked Labor Day alongside Joe Biden in Pittsburgh yesterday, and her running mate, Tim Walz, was out there on the labor trail as well.
We know the simple truth. Wall Street did not build America. The middle class built America, and unions built the middle class.
When unions are strong, America is strong.
We will continue to defend Social Security and Medicare and pensions. We will continue to strengthen America's manufacturing sector.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Gregory Korte. So, Gregory, obviously she is trying to cast herself as just as pro-union as the president she's been serving with for the last 3.5 years. Not a coincidence that she was giving those remarks in Pennsylvania, and she'll be back in Pittsburgh later this week as well.
Yeah, and she was in Michigan before she got to Pittsburgh, which is another, obviously, union stronghold. And she's really sort of zeroing in on those working class, middle class voters with a lot of these economic proposals. You mentioned the small business one, which she'd previously announced home ownership assistance up to $25,000 for first-time home buyers, but also the no taxes on tips, which Trump had originally proposed. So she's trying to go tit for tat with Trump on a lot of these policies and even sort of seeing his ante and raising it on really sort of targeting what she hopes will be a key voting bloc in that middle class, middle America voter.
They're both working overtime to get an endorsement from the Teamsters Union. We saw some members of the Teamsters actually speak at the Chicago convention for Democrats, but Sean O'Brien's holding out. He wanted an invite. Remember, he wasn't very happy about what he heard Donald Trump say to Elon Musk about firing workers trying to organize. On Sunday morning on CBS, he said, you don't hire someone unless you give them an interview. So what's taking so long?
Well, I think, look, these are groups that don't want to be taken for granted. They have been part of the Democratic coalition for decades. But they've also seen the rank-and-file union member increasingly not listen necessarily uncritically to what their union bosses, how they want them to vote, but are looking at other issues. A lot of these auto workers, steel workers, manufacturing workers, especially in these blue wall industrial states, may be a little bit more culturally conservative, although they still are voting on union rights as well. But remember, also, there's a large number of other unions, service workers, nurses, teachers, public employees, and in Nevada, critically, the culinary union. And all of these represent different sort of constituencies with different sort of demographics, and some of them, most of them are in the Democratic fold, but they may want to hear a little bit more from Kamala Harris going forward and what she's going to do for the labor vote.
Gregory Korte with us, reporting from Bloomberg this day after Labor Day. Gregory, thank you. This all coming against the backdrop of a difficult weekend in the Middle East, with protests continuing for a third night in Tel Aviv as thousands call for a ceasefire deal with Hamas to bring home the remaining hostages in Gaza. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre addressed the situation earlier today from the briefing room.
We have made it very clear. The president over the weekend made it very, very clear as to who is responsible. It is devastating. The heinous acts that we have seen by Hamas is devastating. And those 6 hostages, their families are grieving. The president was very clear about that in his statement over the weekend, and he's going to continue to work around the clock.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko for more here at the table in Washington. Michelle, it's great to see you. Does the death of these 6 hostages make a ceasefire more or less likely?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, I think that's one of the clear divides today, and especially after we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu last night, Israel time, Monday night, about how this actually makes it less possible to get to a deal. Is in his view that this makes Hamas more culpable and less willing to negotiate, and Israel therefore less willing to negotiate in response. However, that's not the U.S. view. I mean, we heard from President Biden yesterday a little bit. We heard from the White House today, including National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, who said that no, he can only speak for the U.S. He says let Netanyahu speak for himself, but this actually increases the urgency, in their view, to get to a deal that achieves 3 main things that they've been talking about for months: to end the fighting, to get aid into Gaza, and most importantly to them to release the remaining hostages.
President Biden was asked if he'd be speaking with Prime Minister Netanyahu over this weekend. He said eventually. What does eventually mean? Does this not the kind of situation that would mean these 2 leaders need to talk directly as soon as possible?
Right. I mean, this is kind of what we have heard throughout these months of negotiations. Is you catch President Biden in offhand, a reporter exchange a little bit of a gaggle on his travel, and he replies with 1 or 2 word answers, and then the rest of the White House spokespeople have to kind of clean that up and fill that out. But what we heard today is that obviously no readouts no calls to read out at the moment, but they will speak again, and we'll just have to wait and see what will trigger that phone call to happen again. But of course, the 2 leaders will be in constant communication, I'm sure.
Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, thank you so much. Now, just in the last hour, Bloomberg broke the news that the Justice Department has set Nvidia and other companies subpoenas as part of an investigation into antitrust violations. Officials are concerned the tech company is making it difficult to switch to other suppliers and punishes buyers who don't exclusively use its AI chips. That's according to people familiar with the investigation who asked not to be identified as discussions are private. This, of course, comes on top of Nvidia suffering a record $279 billion drop in its market cap today, dragging the NASDAQ 100 down by more than 3% along with it. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz. So, Bailey, obviously it was an ugly day if you're long equities. How much of that is an Nvidia problem versus a larger one?
Kaylee, it seems like it's really been a risk-off day. As you mentioned, those probes that Bloomberg is reporting on are actually weighing on shares in the aftermarket trading, so the stock down another 2% on top of that 9.5% decline. But we really saw tech-heavy companies, whether you're an AI-like chip maker that we're seeing in the semiconductors index under pressure. The NASDAQ 100 had one of its worst days in about a month, as did the S&P 500. So it does really seem like, broadly speaking, investors are kind of dipping or rotating back out of some of those riskier assets and maybe flocking towards safer investments to kickstart September. And it does have a lot of shades of what we saw with last month's sharp sell-off on August 5th.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned August 5th, because we should note, Bailey, that Nvidia is still holding above that level. It came down to below $100. And we know that Nvidia has obviously been, a borderline meme stock with such a big talker here, with so much volatility and liquidity around it. Let's take Nvidia out of the picture for a moment and remind ourselves that it's the day after Labor Day. How much of this is the seasonality, Bailey, that we tend to see this time of year?
I think it's a part of it, Joe, and I think that that's kind of what investors are trying to digest. You are now with Nvidia results in the rearview mirror from last week. The focus is now on economic data. We saw manufacturing data today that maybe was a touch slower or worse than many had expected. You have jobs report at the end of the week. Everyone's focused on the Fed decision later this month. So the real question is, what is the next catalyst? And that's why you see, as you mentioned, September being typically one of the worst months for U.S. markets, because we're in kind of a dearth of news right now, and it's really investors trying to right-size their portfolios in an election year, going into the fourth quarter, and trying to make a better read on what's next.
Worth noting, Nvidia is still up over 100% in the last year. Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz, thank you so much for joining us on a tough day on the markets. We'll keep tabs on this for you as we come back tomorrow. But coming up next, we're joined by Democratic Congresswoman Lori Trahan of Massachusetts, next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
If I'm elected this November, for the first time ever, your government will pay for or require insurance companies to pay for all costs associated with IVF fertility treatment. We want more babies to be born in America.
It was Donald Trump last week on the campaign trail talking about making in vitro fertilization fully covered by the government, either have the government pay for it or mandate that insurance companies do. Comments that come as the Harris campaign launches a bus tour highlighting the fight over reproductive freedoms. Joining us now to talk about this and other issues, Democratic Congresswoman Lori Trahan of Massachusetts. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you with us today. We should note that you're the mother of two girls conceived via IVF. You have a unique perspective here on something that a lot of Americans are suddenly talking about here in the public square. Would you support a proposal like the one Donald Trump just made?
Yes, if he could be a reliable messenger for people who rely on IVF. I mean, look, we want people to have access to IVF and fertility treatment. We know that millions of women struggle with fertility at some point in their lives, and many have to turn to IVF or fertility treatment to get pregnant or to sustain their pregnancy. The clearest way that I see us doing that is passing the Right to IVF Act so that we can make sure that every woman, no matter what state she lives in, has access to that treatment. But I think we're experiencing whiplash right now with Republicans saying one thing and then doing another on this topic, along with abortion access and mifepristone and so many other things that are really causing panic, I think, in women across the country.
Well, certainly we have seen a change in the enthusiasm and the leanings of female voters, at least in polling, since Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee, or the presumptive one at that, Congresswoman. How are you thinking about how her candidacy, and specifically the fight that she is framing on reproductive rights, is having an impact for your colleagues in the House, who are, of course, trying to turn into the majority, not the minority?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, well before Vice President Harris was the nominee for president, she was traveling all over the country, not just talking about how we can do better and codify Roe and give women the assurance that they'll have access to these treatments that we've relied on for 50 years. But she was also listening to stories, the horrific stories that we're seeing in states with these Republican abortion bans. So she is giving, I think, hope now, to women across the country as she campaigns, as she talks about this from a place of deep knowledge and empathy on what needs to change and what will change when she's president. So I think you are seeing women motivated and organized to get to the polls because, she represents our country moving forward and ending the days of us turning back the clock on our children, on our daughters.
This is clearly an important issue for this campaign, Congresswoman, but we're told that none compare to the economy And the polling that we've seen most recently from Suffolk University just out in the last 24 hours, close to home for you, but also ABC News, Ipsos, and our own Bloomberg News swing state poll show that Kamala Harris is underwater when it comes to who do you trust to handle the economy, who do you trust to handle inflation. What do you hear from people on the North Shore of Massachusetts? How does she break through in that message with voters in your district?
Yeah, so one, I do think it's going to take a little bit of time. I'm just keep in mind she's only been the nominee, for about a month, and she's already going and crafting and talking about her opportunity economic agenda. When I talk to people in Lowell and Lawrence and across, my district, they want their representatives and their next president to focus on bringing down inflation, creating an economy where you can afford a home, you can afford childcare, and making sure our community is safer. Certainly, as we just talked about, keeping politicians out of the doctor's office. But I think what Vice President Harris is really talking about is how we're going to grow our middle class. How are we going to make sure that everybody has access to that opportunity? And you're seeing that through specific proposals, increasing our housing stock by 3 million more units, making sure that first-time home buyers have the ability to put down a down payment. And I think we're just going to hear more of what her specific plans are for, the everyday kitchen table issues that people are really grappling with. But we have, 64 days to the election, and we're going to use every single last day and minute to make sure people know what's at stake.
Well, and of course, those 63 days are likely to pass very quickly. You will be spending some of them back in Washington after a long summer district work period. The return is next Monday. What are you bracing for when you go back to Capitol Hill, knowing that there's going to be a spending fight of some kind that has to go down before September 30th?
Yeah, well, there's no question that we would face another government shutdown if Democrats and Republicans don't come together to pass what's likely going to be a short-term funding bill. Unfortunately, one of the things that we're hearing is that the bill that's being talked about right now, it's riddled with poison pills that Republicans know are going to make the legislation a non-starter.
Are you referring to the SAVE Act?
Yes. And we've been here before. I mean, this entire Congress has been marked with Democrats having to step up and really be the adults in the room to make sure that we avert a debt ceiling crisis, a government shutdown last October. We want to make sure that we come together and we pass a short-term bill without any unnecessary poison pills that are attached to it, so that we can keep the government open and make sure that we protect our economy and the hardworking families back home.
Well, we have less than a minute, Congresswoman, so I'll ask you what we asked your colleague, Congressman Jake Auchincloss, a little bit earlier today. We're on a new stick, a new signal on the radio in the city of Boston, 92.9 FM, so no one can hide from this conversation, Congresswoman. Be careful what you say. I ask you that, of course, in jest. Is it then not possible to tell our audience that we will avoid a government shutdown this year?
Look, I think at the end of the day, we will. No, one, it's not good electoral politics for sure. And I think Republicans have learned that lesson by bringing us to the brink several times. But, we have to stop these partisan games. Attaching the SAVE Act to a short-term funding bill, it's regrettably more politics that the American people are tired of. So I'm going to remain optimistic. We've got a couple of weeks before that deadline to come together and put something that will pass the House and pass the Senate so that we avert that at all costs.
All right, Democratic Congresswoman Lori Trahan of Massachusetts, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, Japan's largest steel maker facing fresh scrutiny in its bid to take over U.S. Steel. Vice President Kamala Harris addressing the deal for the first time over the weekend. We'll have more on how they're addressing that potential merger amid concerns from unions. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. The Tuesday edition. As we come back from the long weekend, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington with fresh opposition now to Japan-based Nippon Steel's planned acquisition of U.S. steel. Vice President Kamala Harris now speaking out for the first time against the deal as it becomes a focal point in the race for the White House. That is where Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now with more. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Vice President Kamala Harris says that U.S. Steel should remain American-owned and operated. It's the latest wave of scrutiny for what would be a $14.1 billion acquisition by Nippon Steel, a Japan-based company. Now, here was the vice president over the long weekend on Labor Day addressing union supporters in the battleground of Pennsylvania.
U.S. Steel is an historic American company, and it is vital for our nation to maintain strong American steel companies. And I couldn't agree more with President Biden. U.S. Steel should remain American-owned and American-operated.
In a statement to Bloomberg News after those comments, U.S. Steel says it remains committed to the deal, adding it will, quote, strengthen the American steel industry, American jobs, and American supply chains, and enhance the U.S. steel industry's competitiveness and resilience against China. Concerns about the acquisition range from potential national security threats to what it could mean for unionized jobs, and it's coming from both sides of the aisle. Former President Donald Trump has said that he would block the deal outright, and I actually had the chance to catch up with his now running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, earlier this year. He explained his opposition to the deal to me like this back in May.
Having one of the most important national security materials, we have to have more control over production in our own country. And that's not a slap in the face or an insult to the Japanese. That's a recognition that Japan's a lot closer to China. They're fundamentally within China's sphere of influence.
The Trump campaign tells me Vance still holds that view. Shares of U.S. Steel fell to their lowest intraday price since mid-June today. They originally surged last December when Nippon's bid was announced, but scrutiny continues to ramp up as we near the election, and both campaigns court the labor vote, particularly in battlegrounds like Pennsylvania. U.S. Steel actually went against the request of the U.S. Steel Workers Union, which has backed the Harris campaign. They wanted the Ohio-based company Cleveland-Cliffs Mills to instead make that acquisition. But regardless, Joe and Kaylee, this merger is currently stalled as it undergoes a national security review by the U.S. government.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting from the White House this evening. Thank you so much. Of course, that one aspect of competition we're watching. The other, of course, came earlier this afternoon, Joe, when Bloomberg broke the news that the DOJ had sent subpoenas to companies, including Nvidia, over concern about potential antitrust violations when it comes to AI chips. Nvidia has now responded to our report, saying customers can choose whatever solution is best.
Doesn't seem to be helping the stock in after-hours trading, which is something that we'll be looking at tomorrow. Tough run for Nvidia today with breaking news from Washington, courtesy of Bloomberg.
Indeed. And of course, we're watching the Middle East as well. The fallout after the deaths of 6 hostages in Gaza. We'll have more with Michael Allen next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is my frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's not that he is insisting on Israel's security. It's not that he's insisting on Hamas being excluded from post-war governance. I agree with him on those things. My frustration with the Prime Minister is that he is not offering a vision of reconstruction for Gaza, Palestinian-led, Arab-supported, Western-backed, that would truly drain Hamas's political capital.
That was Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss in Massachusetts earlier today, discussing the growing frustration among him and among Israelis with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the aftermath of the death of 6 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza this weekend. Joining us now for more is Michael Allen, Managing Director and Partner of Beacon Global Strategies. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, sir. It's always great to have you, even under difficult circumstances like this one. Obviously, there was an American who was involved in this, Hirsch Goldberg Poland. There have been thousands of protesters who have taken to the streets in Israel. But do you actually believe it changes anything for the Netanyahu government?
I do think that the pressure is getting substantially more. I think the protests are the largest since October 7th. I know that Netanyahu still does have an electoral lock on his prime ministership as long as he keeps these right-wing ministers in his camp. Nonetheless, I think when there's so many people putting all this pressure on every side of the system, I do think it starts to create a situation where there are too many vibrations and things might in time, begin to unravel.
We heard today from the State Department, in fact, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller talking about this. He spoke about the U.S.
It requires Israel and it requires Hamas to make difficult decisions to reach an agreement. And what we will continue to do on behalf of the United States and what we believe Qatar and Egypt will continue to do is to impress upon those parties why an agreement is in their interest and why an agreement is in the interest of the region. But ultimately, we're not the ones that can make that decision.
Much of the sticking point has been around what to do with the Philadelphia corridor along the border that Gaza shares with Egypt. Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to leave. There are members of his war cabinet who think that a temporary withdrawal might actually help to grease the skids on a ceasefire. Would that be enough to do it?
I doubt it would be enough because in addition to the Philadelphia corridor, the Hamas leader, Sinwar, wants Netanyahu to say the war is completely over, whereas permanent ceasefire, whereas the Israelis want to be able to go back in if they see some sort of reemergence of Hamas somewhere within Gaza. I also think there's still issues about just which Hamas terrorists would be released from prison. There's a dispute on Hamas wants to turn over the exact names of people, whereas the Israelis are more general and say, we'll let this number of Hamas insurgents be released from prison. So I think there's still other stumbling points beyond this one. This one's just the most tangible. This is the one that seems to have come on the latest, and that's the one that's getting all of the attention since last Thursday. There was this huge dispute within the security cabinet in Israel where they almost came to fisticuffs over what the Israeli policy should be.
We did have some news breaking just a few minutes ago from the Department of Justice, who announced charges against Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and others for their roles in planning, supporting, and perpetrating the October 7th attack on Israel. What does that really accomplish? Does that actually perhaps make it more difficult to reach a ceasefire agreement if the U.S. is a mediator in this, is pursuing criminal charges against the leader of the organization?
You know, I'm more from the post-9/11 school of they have declared war on people. This is more like war than it is law enforcement. And to just issue an indictment, I think, sort of sends a message of U.S. weakness. Where the United States needs to have been stronger for many months, and it's not too late, is that Hamas is backed by Iran. Iran should have been receiving so much more pressure from us. Oil sanctions, which we've talked about before, any number of other military actions that we could have taken, not war, but to put pressure on them to ultimately say to Hamas and their other terrorist proxies in the region, hey, you know what, it's time to scale things down a bit. They haven't done that. I think the Biden administration is sort of ideologically thinking we've got to be able to get some sort of arrangement with Iran and talk to them more, but it hasn't worked. And so therefore you see the administration beat up Israel for not making enough concessions instead of the other side.
I want to ask you about what's happening in Ukraine as we balance these two stories. Michael, earlier today, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, shared this video on X, what we used to call Twitter, following a Russian missile strike that has renewed his call for help to close the skies, as he puts it.
I received preliminary reports regarding the Russian strike on Poltava. According to the information available now, 2 ballistic missiles hit the territory of an educational institution and a neighboring hospital. One of the buildings of the Communications Institute was partially destroyed. People were trapped under the rubble. Many were rescued. More than 180 people were injured. Unfortunately, many people were killed.
Michael, Russian missiles killed more than 50 people in what was one of the deadliest strikes. But of course, just days ago, we were talking about this successful incursion, this cross-border incursion that Ukraine has brought to Russia, the continued drone strikes by Ukraine against Russia. We're seeing a lot of retaliation now. Is this war headed for some sort of crescendo in the near term?
I still think fundamentally it's more along the lines of a stalemate than it is to some sort of dynamic battlefield situation. However, there are, as you mentioned, the Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians. They have made substantial sojourns into that particular territory. And, of course, it's not, we don't hear about it as much, but the Russians are continuing to make steady progress in the Donbass. So everyone is trying to figure out who's going to pull out troops first to defend against the incursion by the other side. There's a lot going on, and you're right, the Russians keep hitting the other side and trying to cause civilian casualties as if to say, we are not letting you get away from this easily.
Well, and of course, Zelensky is re-upping his calls for more air defense systems as a result. They have Patriot missile systems. They've been given the first batch of F-16s, even though we learned last week that they had actually lost one. What could actually help Ukraine avoid attacks like this in the future that the U.S. and other Western allies aren't currently providing?
It's more Patriot weapon systems, first and foremost. Honestly, Greece, Spain, there are other NATO allies. I know they don't want to give up their systems, but they could stand to donate their systems and the missiles that are accompanying them to the Ukrainians. That's what we ought to be focusing on. There are other air defense systems which are also important, but honestly, it's more Patriots from nations that don't really need them because of where they sit in the NATO alliance.
Otherwise, it's a very cold winter ahead once again for Ukraine, isn't it?
That's right, it is.
Michael, it's great to have you back. Michael Allen, Managing Director, Partner, Beacon Global Strategies. Thank you, as always, for being with us on Bloomberg. And coming up, we'll take a look at candidates and their strategy for winning over the swing states next with our signature panel. Rick and Jeannie back together this day after Labor Day on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We all know costs are too high, but while corporations are gouging families, Trump is focused on giving them tax cuts. But Kamala Harris is focused on you.
Building up the middle class will be a defining goal of my presidency.
She'll make groceries more affordable by cracking down on price gouging, and she'll cut housing costs by taking on corporate speculators.
That was Kamala Harris's latest ad, where she continues to drive home the message that she is focused on the middle class. Focused, the name of that spot, part of a $370 million ad buy that's going to run straight through the election. And joining us now is our signature panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. They are both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Great to see you both here as it gets real. We've been hearing, of course, Rick, on and on that people don't pay attention until after Labor Day. And here we are. I guess we're all paying attention now. I tend to think people might have tuned in a little bit earlier because of the news this time around. But when you see an ad like that, knowing that Kamala Harris has been part of the Biden administration for the last 3 years, isn't the obvious retort, how come you haven't done it yet?
Yeah, of course. But right now, she's sort of, talking into a vacuum. $300 million ad buy by the Harris campaign is a heck of a way to start the last 60 days of the campaign, right? And so she gets to speak in these states really in a vacuum. She doesn't have Donald Trump making those attack ads right now in most of these places. So this ad is designed to get you to feel better about what she's going to do in the future and not worry so much about how you feel today. Notice, no conversation about the record of Bidenomics or whether or not, the inflation is down. It's all about how she's going to make your pocketbook go further. And look, I think the design of the ad is smart. It's not a contrast ad. She's not really even attacking Donald Trump. Right. She's making the enemy the corporate state, right, who's putting pressure on you.
Does she, though, Rick, need to start attacking Donald Trump more explicitly, or is he well known enough, having run for president, now it's his third go at it, that he doesn't need to be defined in these kind of messages?
Yeah, I think that they're not attacking Trump, they're trolling Trump, right? And so a lot of what they're doing is to get Trump upset, but not necessarily change the public view of him, because that's set, as you say. I mean, I can't imagine a situation where you could unleash $300 million worth of attack ads on Donald Trump and his negatives would go anywhere other than where they are. He's already significantly more negative than positive to voters. So what do you got to change? She has the advantage, Kamala Harris, of having basically an even persona, where she has as many people who like her as dislike her, and that's a winning formula. So why tangle with that?
Interesting.
Use your ad time to really sell who you are, in the softest way you can, and that's what this design is.
All right, Jeannie, let's bring you in here on this. The ad says that Kamala Harris's proposals be making groceries more affordable by cracking down on price gouging and cutting housing costs by taking on corporate speculators. Is this the beginning of trying to distance herself, trying to show sunlight between herself and Joe Biden on the economy?
It is one aspect of that. And, you know, what she's doing here is very smart. One of the big criticisms of Joe Biden was not necessarily his policies, but the fact that he seemed sort of defensive about what he had done. And it was not giving people the sense that he really understood the pain they were in economically as a result of COVID and everything that had happened. And so what she is doing is not so much about the policies. I mean, economists left, right, and center say price fixing is not the answer. But what she is doing is saying, I feel your pain, to use an overused phrase. She is saying, I understand where you've been and what this has been like for you, and I am going to be addressing that going forward. And she's doing that in a way that Joe Biden didn't, because he so often was talking about bills he passed and data from Wall Street, which matters to a lot of folks, but for people on Main Street was not particularly showing that he was empathetic to their concerns as it pertained to the economy. And his numbers on the economy showed that.
Well, and Jeannie, we're still getting more trickling out of economic policy positions of Kamala Harris. We just learned that she's going to be proposing lifting the small business tax credit to $50,000, up from $5,000. How much do you expect over the course of the next 9 weeks there will be a distinction on tax policies these candidates will pursue, where Harris is looking to cut taxes for small businesses and Donald Trump's talking about a lower corporate tax rate for the big guys?
That's exactly what Harris's team wants to talk about. And you heard it in the ad you played. They are saying, is interested in cutting taxes for big business, billionaires, the wealthy. And I, Harris, am for you. The guy on Main Street, the woman on Main Street, small business owners. She's in New Hampshire tomorrow talking about this very issue. So that's the distinction they want to draw. They want to let Trump worry about the wealthy and the big businesses, and she wants to say she's on the side of the middle class and the rest of us, which is about 95%, 99% of us.
Now, of course, these ads are going to be running through November, as we mentioned, Rick, but a lot of people don't need to wait until then. Voting, we could say, I think credibly, starts this week. Absentee ballots will be mailed out in North Carolina starting on Friday. You could have people putting ballots in mailboxes on Saturday. Then a week later, it's Pennsylvania. You have firsthand experience with this. And as Donald Trump tries to warn people away from early voting, the traps that he could be setting for himself here are significant, aren't they?
Yeah, most Republican strategists and operatives I know just absolutely hate this approach that Donald Trump has taken, which is, to convince people that somehow it's cheating to vote early. And Republicans used to be incredibly good at this, right? We were good at the ground game. We could track where these ballot requests have come from. We could make sure, calling people up, hey, did you get your ballot in? And we were really good at turning out our votes, our zip codes, our precincts. The reality now is that it's almost a contra to that. And in places like North Carolina, I remember in 2008, almost 70% of the vote had already been cast before Election Day. Wow. And you can't make up enough votes on Election Day if you're 5 points behind in that balloting. So the reality is, you're going to have a lot of states that would come moot on Election Day if the Republicans don't get smart and start, really starting to drive these ballot access programs.
Well, of course, it was 2008, Jeannie. That was the last time a Democrat won the state of North Carolina. It's been since 1976 when Jimmy Carter did it that one was able to win both North Carolina and Georgia. But it does seem that Democrats think they actually stand a chance at doing that, especially with more than 50,000 volunteers signed up in southern states. How much difference, as Rick is talking about, actually turning out people to vote and the ground game, will that make?
It's going to make all the difference. Democrats know this is going to be a tough fight. And the fact that they have enthusiasm on their side, as you look at the latest polls, enthusiasm amongst Democrats since Harris took to the top of the ticket, has skyrocketed way over where Donald Trump's folks are. And that has led to a lot of people saying they want to help her get out the vote. They want to go knocking on doors. And that's what Democrats are going to have to count on. And unlike Donald Trump, they have played very well with the idea of early voting. They have encouraged their folks to get out there. They know that this election doesn't start, the voting doesn't start in November. It starts on Friday and it waves on through. And they're spending big time in ads down there to try to make the case and get their voters out. And this is a real concern for Republicans because they are being outspent in a big way to the point where there is some panic there, not just at the top of the ticket, but down ballot as well.
Oh, Jeannie, you're leading us perfectly to our next segment. So hold that thought. Jeannie and Rick will be back as we discuss the Harris campaign shifting millions of dollars to Democratic congressional and state races. We'll take a look at that down ballot effect next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What's interesting about spending this money down ticket, if you look at like North Carolina's 1st district, that's a toss-up district. North Carolina's a swing state for Harris. So if she's able to increase turnout in that 1st district, win that seat, that might help her out at the top of the ticket for the presidential electoral votes.
Spencer Kimball, director of Emerson College Polling Center, earlier today on the down ballot effect of Kamala Harris's campaign momentum. Of course, there's a dollar effect we're learning about today as well. Back with us, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Jeannie, Bloomberg reported today the Harris campaign is shifting $24.5 million to other races, $10 million each to the NRSC and the NRC, or the DCCC and the DRSC, of course, the Senate and Congress campaign committees. And she's even sending money to gubernatorial candidates as well. What does this signal to you? Does she just have too much money to spend?
There's never too much money, Kaylee. She's got a lot of money to spend, that's for sure. I think it also, to the point of the previous speaker, is the fact that these are not separate races. If she can get people out for whether it's on the top of the ticket at the state level for the governor's race or to the down ballot for these House seats that are up for grabs and the Senate, she may also be able to garner some support as well. So I think it's both support for fellow Democrats and also, quite frankly, it's an investment in her own prospects in some of these swing states like North Carolina, which are going to be tough for her and narrow. But if she is able to get more voters out for a down ballot race, all the better for her because they're likely to vote up ballot as well.
So you buy into this boomerang effect, Rick, where you're riding the coattails at the bottom of the ticket, essentially?
No, I don't buy into that at all.
Okay.
I think this is a top-down campaign. It has been. Presidential campaigns direct the vote down, and you lose vote as you go down the ticket. There's no such thing as, turning out more members of Congress than the presidential candidate's going to turn out. You want them to turn out for you, so there may be some undecided voters that, you could influence. But the reality is she's raised over $500 million since she got into the campaign, and the Harris campaign had some extra dough, that they are now looking at states like North Carolina or like New Hampshire and Virginia and Florida and realizing, maybe we can have a little bit of an impact there. But really what's on her mind, I'm quite confident. The vast majority of the funds, as you say, Kaylee, went to the Senate and the House. She would like to have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. And if she can at least say, hey, I gave you $10 million each to do that, that's probably going to be helpful to her long term.
But what are the odds for that realistically right now, Jeannie? Where would you put a figure on a blue sweep?
I think a blue sweep is probably low. It's going to be terribly difficult for the Democrats in the Senate. I give them better odds of picking up seats in the House. So I am not convinced we're going to see that. But I do think these investments down ballot are also investments up at the top of the ticket. Rick and I disagree vehemently on that point. I think that she does invest not just because she certainly wants a Democratic Congress, but because she feels it is going to help her. These people are door knocking. They're not just talking down ballot races. They're talking top of the ticket as well, because these are nationalized races, even at the local level.
Kayleigh's putting Jeannie on the spot. We have to put you on the spot. What's more likely if you don't see a blue sweep, a Democratic House and Republican Senate?
Well, first of all, I think a Republican Senate is almost a foregone conclusion, right? And so if that's the trading range, the thing that I think is fascinating about the House is sometimes it runs ahead of your presidential candidate, like the turnout for the House members sometimes is even better. So the question is, are House Republicans going to do better than Donald Trump, or are House Democrats going to do better than Kamala Harris? And to me, 11-11, 22 targeted states, targeted districts. Let's see what happens.
All right. We got 2 months to find out, everybody. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us for the ride. Thank you, as always, for a great conversation. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And come back and see us here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.